He thought his badge made him untouchable. He thought wrong. For years, Officer James Miller did whatever he wanted. He had a routine. Find someone who looked out of place, pull them over, ask the right questions, and if they gave him even a little attitude, he made sure they regretted it. He knew how to work the system. The reports always made him look like the victim. Resisting arrest. Suspicious behavior. I feared for my safety. It was all code for the same thing, abusing his power and getting away with it. Miller wasn't just another bad cop. He was the type who made people afraid of the police. He stopped black drivers for no reason, followed young Latino men through their own neighborhoods, and treated every complaint against him like a joke. He knew his fellow officers wouldn't speak up. And if someone did try, his bosses would bury it. But one night, his luck ran out. He pulled over the wrong car. A car driven by someone who knew exactly how to handle men like him. He thought it would be just another routine stop, another name to throw into a report, another person too afraid to fight back. He was wrong. This is the story of how one woman's courage shattered a corrupt cop's world. But to understand how it all fell apart, we have to go back to the beginning. Officer James Miller wasn't just another cop. In the small town of Riverside, he had built a reputation, and not the good kind. If you were black, Latino, or Asian, you knew his name. You knew the way he'd park outside minority-owned businesses, just sitting there like a warning sign. If you were a black driver, you knew the feeling of his patrol car creeping behind you for miles, waiting for the smallest excuse to pull you over. To the people of Riverside, Miller wasn't protecting and serving. He was hunting. His power trips weren't just rumors. People had stories. Like Marcus Johnson, a well-respected high school teacher who was stopped while jogging in his own neighborhood. Miller claimed he fit the description of a burglary suspect. No crime had been reported, but that didn't stop Miller from demanding ID, questioning him like a criminal, and making him sit on the curb while neighbors watched. Or Sarah Chen, an elderly Asian woman who took too long crossing the street. Miller accused her of obstructing traffic, detained her for nearly an hour, and left her shaken. Cases like these piled up, but nothing ever happened. Miller wasn't sloppy. He knew how to cover his tracks. Every report he wrote sounded airtight. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior. Officer feared for safety. It was always just vague enough to justify his actions. He understood the system, and he played it well. Even when complaints came in, they disappeared. His bosses backed him, and fellow officers, even the ones who hated what he did, stayed quiet. No one wanted to be the one to go against him. And Miller knew it. You could see it in the way he carried himself, in the smug grin he flashed whenever another complaint got dismissed. "Just doing my job," he'd say, tapping his badge like it made him invincible. He believed nothing could touch him. He believed he could do whatever he wanted. But that arrogance would be his downfall. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thompson had spent over 2 decades serving her country. She wasn't just another soldier. She was a leader. With 2 tours in Afghanistan under her belt, she had seen the worst of war, but she had also seen the power of discipline, structure, and justice. She wasn't just trained in combat. She was an expert in military law. She had spent years teaching military police the right way to handle authority, drilling into them that power wasn't a weapon. It was a responsibility. But Sarah's impact went beyond the military. Even after all her years of service, she wasn't the type to sit back and watch others struggle. She dedicated her free time to volunteering at the local Veterans Center, helping former soldiers navigate the system, whether it was getting benefits, finding jobs, or simply adjusting to civilian life. She believed in using her knowledge to lift others up, not tear them down. To the young recruits she mentored, she was more than just a high-ranking officer. She was a guide. Excellence is the best response to ignorance, She'd remind them whenever they faced discrimination or unfair treatment. She didn't believe in fighting fire with fire. She believed in standing your ground, knowing your rights, and using the system against those who abused it. That morning, she wasn't looking for trouble. She was just on her way to the Veterans Center, dressed casually, driving her personal car, no uniform, no military insignia, just another citizen going about her day. But to Officer James Miller, none of that mattered, because to him she was just another black driver in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that was all the excuse he needed. Officer James Miller sat at a red light, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. His eyes landed on a black SUV in the next lane. The driver was a black woman, mid-40s, wearing sunglasses, her posture straight, confident. Something about her calm presence irritated him. He'd learned to trust his gut, and right now, his gut told him she didn't belong. As soon as the light turned green, he pulled in behind her. No traffic violations, no reckless driving, just a feeling. He followed her for blocks, staying close enough to let her know he was there. Intimidation always worked. Sometimes they'd make a nervous mistake, roll through a stop sign, switch lanes without signaling. Then, he'd have a reason. But she drove perfectly, steady hands, controlled speed. No mistakes, that didn't matter. He flipped on his sirens. Inside the SUV, Sarah Thompson glanced in her rearview mirror. Another traffic stop. Another officer abusing his badge. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes. She just signaled, pulled over, and put the car in park. This wasn't her first time being profiled. It probably wouldn't be her last. But she had nothing to hide. Miller approached the window, his face already set in that familiar look of authority. Chest puffed out, hand resting near his belt. The dash cam on his patrol car was rolling. So was Sarah's. "License and registration," he ordered, his tone sharp, clipped. No courtesy, no explanation. Sarah moved slowly, keeping her hands in clear view. She had spent years training soldiers on how to de-escalate tense situations, and she knew how fast things could go wrong. She handed over her driver's license, her registration, and, because she knew exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, her military ID. Miller barely glanced at the first two. But when he saw the military ID, he stopped. His lip curled slightly. He tapped the card against his palm. "You expect me to believe this is real?" Sarah met his eyes, calm and steady. "Yes, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thompson." Miller let out a short, mocking laugh. "Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense." He stepped back. "Step out of the car." Sarah didn't move right away. She studied his posture, his tone. He had already made up his mind. He wasn't asking. He was looking for control. She knew how this worked. If she hesitated, he'd say she was resisting. If she questioned him, he'd escalate. She unbuckled her seatbelt and got out. Miller grabbed her arm. Too hard, too fast. A flex of power. Sarah stiffened, instincts kicking in. He had no reason to use force, no probable cause, no justification. "You're making a mistake," she said evenly. Miller smirked. "Yeah? We'll see about that." She felt the cold steel of handcuffs snap around her wrists. Her phone was still recording in the car. The dash cam was rolling. Everything was being documented. But Miller didn't seem to care. As he shoved her into the back of his patrol car, he leaned in close, just enough for her to hear. "Not so high and mighty now, huh, Colonel?" Sarah sat back, steadying her breath. She had faced worse men than him, and unlike Miller, she actually understood the law. He thought he was in control, but he had just arrested the wrong woman. Miller strutted into the station, full of himself. He tossed Sarah's military ID onto his desk like it was a cheap fake, shaking his head. "Got myself a fake military officer today," he announced, loud enough for the whole room to hear. A few officers chuckled, used to his antics, but not everyone was laughing. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran on the force, frowned as he picked up the ID. Something about this didn't sit right. He examined it closely. The name, the rank, the official seal. His stomach dropped. This wasn't a fake. This was the real deal. "Miller, we need to talk. Now." Miller rolled his eyes but followed Rodriguez to the side. "What?" he snapped. Rodriguez kept his voice low. "That woman in the holding cell? She's Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Thompson, 20 years in the military police, a legal expert." His eyes locked onto Miller's. "You just arrested someone who trains people like us, except they actually follow the law." Miller's smugness faltered. "So what?" She refused to comply. Rodriguez shook his head. "You know damn well she didn't." Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the holding cell, completely calm. She wasn't worried about getting out. She was already working on something much bigger. When an officer came to offer her a phone call, she took it. But she didn't call a lawyer. She dialed Colonel James Martinez, a high-ranking military attorney with connections all the way to Washington. When he answered, she put him on speakerphone. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Colonel Martinez, I need you to listen carefully." The room went silent as his voice boomed through the phone. "You have 1 hour to release Lieutenant Colonel Thompson before I call the police commissioner, the mayor, and the Department of Justice. If she isn't out by then, I will personally make sure this department regrets it." Miller felt the first real wave of panic settle in. His hands were suddenly clammy. The officers around him looked uneasy. This wasn't just some random civilian. This was someone with real power. Rodriguez didn't waste a second. He grabbed the paperwork Miller had started and shoved it into a drawer. "This never happened." Miller swallowed hard. "But, no but. Do you understand what you just did? You screwed up. Badly." Miller turned toward his desk. But now he noticed something. His reports, they were gone. His paperwork, the forms documenting the arrest, had vanished. He looked around the station. Officers who once laughed at his arrogance were now avoiding his eyes. No one wanted to be dragged into this. But Sarah wasn't done. Getting released was never the goal. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure Miller never did this to anyone else again. She leaned back in the holding cell, watching as the department started to unravel around her. Miller thought he was in control, but his time was running out. The next morning, Miller walked into the station like he always did, head high, shoulders back, acting like he owned the place. But something was off. His usual parking spot was taken. Someone had beaten him to it. Small thing, but it irritated him. Inside, the mood was different. Conversations hushed as he walked by. A few officers who used to greet him with nods or smirks suddenly seemed busy with their paperwork. In the break room, 2 officers he knew well, guys who used to laugh at his jokes, stood near the coffee machine, speaking in low voices. The moment Miller stepped in, they stopped talking. One of them grabbed his coffee and left without a word. Miller frowned. What the hell was going on? Across town, Sarah Thompson sat in a quiet office, across from Diana Chen, an internal affairs investigator with a reputation for being relentless. On the table between them sat a thick folder. Diana pushed it toward Sarah. 37 incidents, she said, tapping the cover. 15 formal complaints, most of them buried until now. Sarah flipped through the pages. Harassment, excessive force, racial profiling. The same pattern over and over. Some reports had notes from higher-ups, justifications, excuses. But this time, things were different. "There are 3 officers willing to testify," Diana continued. "They've been waiting for the right moment to come forward. Your case was the final push they needed." Sarah nodded. "It's time." Back at the station, Miller's phone buzzed. A text from his union rep. "Don't talk to anyone. We have a situation." His chest tightened. He looked up and saw Sergeant Rodriguez walking toward him. Behind him, 2 men in suits. Internal Affairs. Miller stood, trying to keep his face neutral. "Something I can help you with?" Rodriguez didn't answer, just stepped aside as the 2 investigators reached Miller's desk. "James Miller?" one of them asked. Miller swallowed. "Yeah. You need to come with us." For the first time in years, Miller felt something he hadn't felt before. Fear, and it was too late to stop what was coming. The hearing room was full. Officers, victims, former colleagues, even retired judges who had once ruled on Miller's cases filled the seats. The tension in the air was thick. This wasn't just about Miller anymore. It was about every unchecked abuse that had been ignored for years. Sarah walked in, standing tall in her full military dress uniform, a quiet statement of who she was, what she stood for. Miller barely glanced at her, but she could see the stiffness in his posture, the way his hands clenched into fists under the table. The first witness was Marcus Johnson, the teacher Miller had harassed. He spoke calmly, recounting the night Miller accused him of looking suspicious just for jogging in his own neighborhood. The audience murmured as he described the fear, the humiliation, the way Miller had smirked when he finally let him go without an apology. Next, an elderly woman took the stand. She needed help getting to the chair, but her voice was steady. She described how Miller had detained her at a crosswalk, claiming she was impeding traffic because she moved too slowly. She had been terrified, she said, but she had learned that fear was exactly what men like him counted on. Miller shifted in his seat. His lawyer whispered something to him, but his usual cocky smirk was gone. Then came the final blow. Officer Jenny Martinez, his former rookie partner, took the stand. There was a pause as she adjusted the mic, gathering herself. Then, in a firm voice, she detailed the first time she saw Miller cross the line. How he had falsified reports. How he had laughed when she hesitated to back him up on an arrest that had no legal grounds. And how, when she questioned him, he had told her, "You'll learn how things really work here." The final piece of evidence came from Tommy Chen, an IT specialist. He pulled up video footage on a large screen. Dash cam footage, Miller's own voice captured crystal clear. "Delete this! This never happened!" Silence. Then a low murmur rippled through the room. The board didn't take long to deliberate. The decision was unanimous. Miller was stripped of his badge, his law enforcement certification revoked permanently. The case was referred for criminal charges. He stood there, stunned, as the verdict sank in. The badge that once made him feel untouchable was now worthless. Sarah watched, her face unreadable. This was justice, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. There was still more work to be done. The fallout from Miller's downfall sent shockwaves through the department. Civilians cheered, but for Sarah, this was just the beginning. A single bad cop losing his badge wasn't enough. The real fight was against the system that had protected him for so long. She pushed for real change. With support from internal affairs and community leaders, a civilian oversight committee was created, something the town had never seen before. Every complaint against an officer would now be reviewed by an independent board, not just buried in a file. Old cases, including the ones Miller had dodged for years, were reopened. New training protocols were introduced. Officers were taught how to de-escalate situations instead of using intimidation. Racial profiling seminars became mandatory. Sarah personally trained young officers, showing them what real law enforcement looked like, built on respect, not fear. But the most surprising moment came from someone Sarah never expected. At a public meeting, a young officer stood up. Officer Katie Miller, James Miller's own daughter. She walked to the front of the room, placed her father's old badge on the table, and looked out at the crowd. "This is what real policing looks like," she said, her voice steady. She was choosing justice over family loyalty, proving that change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. The results spoke for themselves. Complaints against officers dropped by 60% in just 1 year. The younger generation of cops, many trained by Sarah, handled stops differently. People no longer felt afraid when they saw flashing lights in their rearview mirror. And Miller? He had gone from being the most feared cop in town to working night security at a mall, his authority reduced to checking receipts at the exit. As for Sarah, she was still teaching, still fighting for accountability. Because justice wasn't a one-time victory. It was a battle she would never stop fighting. This story wasn't just about one corrupt cop losing his badge. It was about the power of standing up, documenting everything, and fighting back the right way. Sarah didn't yell. She didn't argue. She let the facts speak for themselves. And in the end, that's what brought Miller down. Bullies like Miller don't stop until someone shows them they're not untouchable. He spent years abusing his authority, convinced no one could touch him. But all it took was one person who knew the system better than he did, one person who refused to back down. That's the real message here. Corruption doesn't disappear on its own. It takes people willing to speak up, to record, to demand accountability. And that someone could be you. Have you ever witnessed or stood up to abuse of power? Share your story in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if you want more stories where justice wins, check out our HOA Madness and subscribe for more. Because the fight for accountability is far from over.